Why not? We are here to answer the questions that you have about the Catholic faith. Maybe you don't know who to ask. You can certainly ask us. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Outside North America, please dial 1 and then 205-271-2985. You can also text the letters EWTN to 58177. Wait for our response and then text us your first name and your brief question. Message and data rates may apply. And of course, you can always send us an email. That address is ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Pedro Quiles, our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Rich Jesse is handling social media right now. If you have a question to ask via YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming on both those platforms right now. Just put your question in the comments box if you would, please. And then Rich will send that to us here in the studio. Again, the phone number, 833-288-EWTN. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
I am well. How are you, my friend?
I'm hanging in there. I spent 5 hours at the DMV today getting my new federally updated driver's license.
With the star on it, right?
Star, exactly. And that was after a failed attempt to do so yesterday and Monday. So 3 days in a row, I've spent way too much time in state offices in the last 3 days. But other than that, I'm happy to be here with you guys.
Well, we're happy to have you. It's kind of like cramming the night before the final, isn't it?
Yeah, I should have done this like 2 years ago. The deadline is May 7th,
And yet here we are.
Here I am.
All right. So we're going to lead off with this very interesting question from Mike. Mike says, I had someone ask me, the Bible mentions Jesus' relatives. I concurred they were probably cousins. So why did they not take care of the Blessed Virgin Mary instead of St. John?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have no idea, except that Christ entrusted her to St. John. I know when my dad was dying, he had a lot of people that he could entrust his wife to, and he turned and looked at me and stuck his finger in my face. Well, actually, he couldn't do that because he was paralyzed, but it felt like he stuck his finger in my face, and he said, "You're in charge, meaning take care of your mom. The lot falls to you." I wasn't the only person available, but I was the one he pointed to.
A prudential decision.
Decision.
All right, Mike, thanks so much for your email. Here's one now from another Mike, this one in Mentor, Ohio. Is it true that the prayer, Lord have mercy, is always answered in the New Testament? Are we allowed to pray to our deceased loved ones and communicate with them? So that's actually two different questions.
Two deceased loved ones. Actually, I want to jump back on the St. John question for a second, because there is more to it than that, and my brain is still in the DMV, so I got to come back to theology land. So, more is going on in the passage in John than Jesus just looking out for his mom.
Okay,
right?
All right.
He is entrusting the Blessed Virgin as the mother of all those who believe in Christ. She is the mother of the Redeemer. She's the mother of God. She's the mother of the church. And this is signaled by his very language. When he doesn't say, "Hey, John, look after my mom," he says, "Woman, behold your son." And he uses that same language in John chapter 2 of the business with the turning the water into wine. And the language is highly reminiscent of the fall account in Genesis chapter 3, when God prophesies that the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent. And then again in Revelation chapter 12, where we see a woman clothed with the sun, moon, and stars, who is said to be in battle with that great serpent, the devil, and who gives birth to the child that rules the nations with a rod of iron. So there's an iconic role that the Blessed Virgin Mary has. That it extends beyond her private person, and John, as the beloved disciple, is as it were kind of a symbol for the filial relationship that the entire church has with the Mother of God, right? So they have an office. Each of those characters has an office within sacred Scripture and in the church that Christ founded, that's distinct from mere natural parentage. So that's a better answer. How about that?
It is a better answer.
Now, let's see. The other question was...
should I repeat that?
Is Lord have mercy always answered?
In the New Testament.
In the New Testament. Well, that's a good question. I haven't actually sat there and done the work on that. Is it the case that everyone who asks Jesus for mercy or God for mercy receives mercy? I can't think of any counterexamples. There's a prominent example of someone asking God. Well, I guess maybe there is a counterexample. Paul specifically asks God to remove a particular form of suffering from him, his thorn in the flesh. We don't know what the thorn in the flesh was. We don't know that. And Paul asks God if he would remove it, and God says no, right? But in the gospel accounts, it seems those who approach Christ with a petition for mercy usually received what they were asking for.
Okay, very good.
And then, can we pray to our deceased relatives? Yes. Yeah, you can. If you believe that that they died in the state of grace and that they're either in purgatory or heaven, then you certainly can. Now, if they're not canonized saints, and most of our relatives are not canonized saints, they can't be proposed for the public veneration of the church. They're not going to get a date in the liturgical calendar or that sort of thing. But privately, you can do that.
Well, it's interesting because the last part of that sentence, and I'll read it again, are we allowed to pray to our deceased loved ones and communicate with them?
Communicate with them. Well, depends on what you mean. It's not two-way communication.
No.
Right? So praying and asking for their intercession, yes. Seeking to get input from them, no, that's the sin of necromancy, and that's strictly forbidden to Catholics.
Not going there.
Not going there.
Very good. Mike in Mentor, Ohio, thanks so much for your email. Now, if you would like to send us an email for a future show, here's the address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. We try to answer a couple of emails on each of our live shows, and then once a month or so, we'll do a mailbag program and take care of a whole bunch of emails. Again, ctc@ewtn.com. All right, calls are coming in right now. Matt is busy screening those calls, but there's line for you at 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986, or if you prefer, text the letters EWTN to 58177. Back in a flash with lots more Call to Communion on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN.
Hi, this is Mike Aquilino with a few words about St. Agnes of Rome. She was a teen or tween when she refused a marriage proposal. She could not marry because she had consecrated herself to Jesus. Her jilted suitor denounced her as a Christian, and she was condemned. Agnes's courage in facing death was a major factor in the conversion of Rome.
Teresa Tomeo and Italy's Shrines and Wonders.
Directly in front of the Basilica of St. Francis in Assisi is a statue that often goes unnoticed by pilgrims but is worth a closer look. The return of St. Francis was placed here only 20 years ago, but in some ways is as important as the exquisite 14th century frescoes inside the famous church. The sculpture showing Francis dressed in full armor sitting slouched on a horse in a position of complete humility represents not only his defeated return to Assisi after realizing he would not fulfill a dream of serving the Lord as a knight in the papal army, but his courage to surrender to God's will for his life instead of his own. It's also a reminder for us that surrendering to God is not defeat, but the beginning of a victorious life in Christ.
Italy's Shrines and Wonders by Teresa Tomeo is available now at EWTNRC.com.
It's Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN. Our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Have you heard about the EWTN Pro-Life Pulse? This is your weekly recap of the top pro-life headlines moving our nation and world that sometimes the mainstream media miss out on these things, like swing and a miss. Well, you don't have to worry about that with EWTN. If it's pro-life, we are on top of things. Visit EWTNnews.com/pro-life. Sign up today. Stay connected. All right, and if you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN, beginning with Maria in Maryland, listening on Spotify this afternoon. Hello, Maria. What's on your mind today?
So Dr. Anders did touch on Matthew 16 and the rock, Peter and the rock, anyway. But there's some confusion here that I have Matthew, that you quoted concerning Peter and the papacy, let me just say that at the time of the writings, the Greek Gospels in Jesus' time, there was no punctuation in the writings, so the idea of a rock could easily be attributed to the confession Peter had made in verse 16, not Peter as head of the church, and to loosing or binding on earth, as was said to Peter. It's confusing about the confession.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the question. So the text of St. Matthew never calls out the confession of St. Peter as subject or predicate, right, at all. The text under consideration, the English translation, of course, I say to you, thou art Peter, and on this rock. And in the Greek text, of course, it's Petros, thou art Petros, the masculine form, and then on this rock, Petra. And so there's an obvious homological similarity between those two words, a kind of play on words.
Yeah.
And they're related grammatically as well, syntactically in the sentences. And so that leads, I think, fair-minded commentators. And look, I'll give you an example. So when I was a Protestant, one of the best known evangelical biblical scholars running around in those days was D.A. Carson. And I think he's still around. But anyway, Dr. Carson was pretty deeply anti-Catholic in his personal convictions. I mean, he had no sympathy at all for the Catholic Church. But in his exegesis of this text, he just said, look, grammatically, syntactically, it's evident that Christ is identifying Peter as the rock. However, he went on to conclude, well, that doesn't justify the whole Catholic apparatus. I mean, he had other arguments against the papacy and didn't think it followed from the text, but he said just, grammatically within the context of the passage, seems evidently that it's referring to Peter. Now, the Protestant exegetes who want to deny that, I think, and they invent these reasons like, well, he's referring to the confession. I mean, I've even heard that he was referring to a physical rock, right, and not to Peter. Yeah, I mean, I've heard all kinds of things. I mean, they're motivated, of course, by antipathy to the papacy, I mean, which is understandable. I mean, like they understand this is a classic proof text of Catholicism for the papacy, and they don't want that to be the case. Now, I mean, I think Carson's got a more honest position. Look, as a Catholic, I'll freely admit that Matthew 16 single-handedly does not give you the papacy. I mean, you don't get the funny hats and the conclave and the Pope-mobile out of this, right? I mean, there's a lot of elaboration in a fully orbed doctrine of the papacy that you just cannot squeeze out of Matthew 16. And D.A. Carson, the Baptist Protestant exegete, understands that. And so his position was, look, Peter may be the rock in this limited context, doesn't necessarily translate into a doctrine of the papacy. Now, it is a key proof text for Catholics, but it's just one piece of evidence. It's not the total package.
Maria, is that helpful for you?
It is, although I've also heard that the rock is Jesus. That was something they said in my Catholic, Bible study. So, okay, thanks for the insight. I appreciate it. And love your show.
Thank you so much, Maria. That opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, perhaps you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. 833-288-3986. Let's go to Shannon now, a first-time caller from New Mexico, listening on Sirius XM, Channel 130. Hello, Shannon. What's on your mind today?
Hi, I just want to thank you both so much for the show. I've learned so much. My question is regarding the translations of the Bible. So as I understand it, the Septuagint is the Greek translation which the Catholics adopt and use. So why do Catholics use the Greek translation? And then why later during Reformation did Luther use the Hebrew translation, and kind of what is the controversy that stems between those two?
Okay, great. So the situation is actually a little bit more complicated than your question presupposes. So here's the lay of the land. In antiquity, in the 1st century, 2nd century, really up to the 4th century, when Catholics of any description cited the Old Testament scriptures, they almost universally cited the Septuagint version of the Old Testament. That includes the authors of the New Testament. So the vast majority of New Testament citations of Old Testament passages are citations from the Septuagint. Now, St. Jerome in the 4th century did start to make more avid use of the Hebrew, and he wanted to be able to answer Jewish polemical assertions that Christian claims about the Old Testament were based on the Septuagint and couldn't be defended from the Hebrew. So he wanted to answer that polemical charge.
Okay.
Right? So he mastered Hebrew, and then today, modern biblical scholars, for a variety of reasons, to take an interest in the Hebrew text on its own right. And there's the way modern Bible translations function is you don't translate the Bible from a single manuscript, right? You don't just go find some ancient manuscript and then translate the Bible from that. What you do is you take all of the available evidence at your disposal. That would mean like maybe fragments of thousands of different manuscripts that come from different manuscript families, and the Septuagint, and then you try to critically reconstruct what you think the base text was from which these others derived. And that's problematic from a number of points of view, because before the first century AD, there probably wasn't a static version of the Old Testament. I mean, what we learned from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that there were different versions of individual biblical books, even within Hebrew. Right, and so it's the biblical canon, the biblical texts themselves underwent a process of serious evolution, and the canon itself underwent evolution. Right, but nevertheless, the modern scholars really like to compile a critical text, and so if you pick up most Roman Catholic translations of the Bible, or translations that Roman Catholics would use today, they are going to cite the Hebrew text, and they'll have marginal notes in there that'll note differences sometimes from the Septuagint. Now, interestingly, the Orthodox Church, they're real big on the Septuagint. And so if you pick up a copy of the Orthodox Study Bible, it is an English translation of the Septuagint. That's typically not what you'll find in a Catholic study Bible. It'll be based on a critical text. But in terms of the authority of the Septuagint, this is highly important, right? The New Testament authors cite the Septuagint when they cite the Old Testament, more often than not. And that influences their theology. They take theological positions that are intelligible from within the framework of the Septuagint that don't make as much sense if you cite them out of the Hebrew. And I can't give you any examples off the top of my head, but I mean there are many, and I can give you a book that will go through this and show you one by one how they function. But one very simple one, that the passage about the virgin will give birth, all right? And this is the prophecy in St. Matthew's Gospel about the virgin birth of Christ. That's quite clear in the Septuagint, not so clear in the Hebrew, right? And there are many other examples of this kind of thing. And when it comes to the canon of the Bible, meaning which biblical books should we actually include in our canon, the Catholic Church has from the beginning included in its canon of the Old Testament books that are only present in the Septuagint and not in the Masoretic Hebrew. Okay. And so when you want to know what the controversy is with Protestantism, that's really the nub of the matter. It's the extent of the canon. Did the 7 deuterocanonical books that land in the Septuagint and not in the Hebrew canon, should they be regarded as sacred scripture or not? Now, back in the 4th century, St. Augustine of Hippo, Catholic saint, who was addressing this question, asks himself, he says, well, what should I default to? Should I default to the Hebrew text or the Greek text for these kinds of considerations? And his position was you default to the Greek text because it's the ecclesiastical translation. It's the one the apostles used. It's the one that the authors of the New Testament used. So if you believe in the inspiration of the New Testament cites the Septuagint as authoritative. For Augustine, that was enough, right? Now, another issue that came into play was that the doctrine of the inspiration of the Bible takes on a particular poignancy within Protestantism. Catholics believe that the Bible is inspired, but since Catholics don't regard the Bible as the sole rule of faith, and they think that the Church is infallible, questions of, say, textual criticism and exegesis are not quite as momentous for a Catholic. I mean, if you come by and tell me, well, this proof text for the Trinity that, for centuries was found in the first epistle of St. John, that's actually a later scribal edition. I'm like, okay, fine. That's what you say. No problems. I don't depend on. There's no proof text in Scripture that is the hinge point for all my Catholic dogmas. I essentially get them from the Church, right? But for a Protestant, that sort of thing becomes very, very, very important, because if the Bible's all you got, then you have to you want to make sure you have the best available text. And in Protestant scholasticism, 17th century scholasticism, they get into really arcane debates about the extent and intensity of inspiration. Like, for example, does it extend to Hebrew vowel pointings? Because, in archaic Hebrew, they didn't have vowels.
That's right.
And the Masoretes invented a system of vowel pointings to sort of superscriptions they would put in the text, or subscriptions, to aid in reading. And so Protestant theologians are getting into the weeds with questions like, are vowel pointings inspired? And that sort of drive towards, let's see if we can find what they would call the original orthograph. The text as it came from the hand of St. Luke, or as it came from the hand of Isaiah, becomes a primary occupation within Protestantism. Not so much within Catholicism, for obvious reasons. I mean, I remember within fundamentalist Protestantism, there's a debate among some people. There's a very small minority of fundamentalists that believe that you should only use the King James Bible. You shouldn't use other modern translations. And there are different versions of that position. The Catholic Church, of course, rejects that. But one argument that fundamentalists will give is that the King James is based on a better manuscript tradition. It's based on the Textus Receptus rather than the critical text. And that's a Byzantine manuscript tradition that's very ancient. And I remember when I was still Protestant, but sort of weakening in the knees and tilting Catholic, I approached a scholarly Catholic priest that I knew. And I asked him about these kinds of questions, and he was like, "Yeah, we don't do that. That's not. We don't like those kinds of questions. Those are scholarly questions, but they don't have the same theological moment in Catholicism as they do in Protestantism."
Fascinating.
Oh, by the way, I was going to recommend a book.
Yeah.
I actually just started this book today, so I've kind of got it on the brain.
Really?
Right? It's called "When God Spoke Greek." When God Spoke Greek, the Septuagint and the Making of the Christian Bible by Timothy Michael Law.
There's a good resource for you, Shannon. Thanks so much for your call from New Mexico. Call to Communion here on EWTN. A quick program note for you. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern, we have the Novendialis, which is the Novena of Masses for Pope Francis. That'll be coming to you live from Rome, from the Vatican, 10 a.m. Eastern on EWTN radio and television. You can check that out tomorrow and also again on Friday. A quick question now from Matt watching us on YouTube today. I know prevenient grace is part of Catholic teaching, but I can't find that particular word in the Catechism. Can Dr. Andrews help me with this?
So I have read the Catechism cover to cover. I do not have every paragraph of the Catechism committed to memory.
What?
Right. And so if you have looked through the index of the Catechism and have failed to find the term prevenient grace, it's probably because it's not there. All right. Now, understand that the Catechism is not meant to function as a comprehensive work of dogmatic theology. Now, there are such manuals in existence. One that I often reference, although it's a bit outdated now, but it's still very helpful, is Ludwig Ott's book, Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. That book a lot. And that's 1950, so it doesn't take into consideration the formulations of the Second Vatican Council, but it's still a very helpful point of reference, right? But that's not what the Catechism is. The Catechism is meant to be an authoritative guide for bishops to help them design local catechisms in their particular churches. And so the considerations are, if you're teaching catechumens in the local church, introducing them to the Catholic faith, what are the touch points that Holy Mother Church wants to make sure you cover? And so there's a lot of Catholic teaching that's not going to go in there. Like, you just can't say everything.
Sure.
Right? You're prioritizing.
Yeah.
And it doesn't surprise me, if you didn't find prevenient grace, that the Catechism would not mention it. It does talk about the mystery of predestination. But, the Council of Trent warned to be very cautious in presenting the mystery of predestination, and because it can be misunderstood and the occasion for scandal or whatnot.
Yeah.
And so you're very careful. And so, the theology of grace is very convoluted and difficult in the Catholic tradition. There's lots of fine distinctions and nuances. And it would not surprise me at all if if Ratzinger and Schoenborn and the rest of those good old boys decided that, we're going to just sidestep all of those distinctions and just present a kind of rounded doctrine of grace without all the fine nuances.
Very good. Matt, thanks so much for your question on YouTube. Still wrapping my head around referring to
Schoenborn and Ratzinger as the good old boys.
The good old boys. You do have a way with words, and that's why we do this program. In a moment, we're going to come back and talk with Greg in Chicago. Great question from him. Lines are open for you as well. 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Call to communion on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN.
Please join us for a novena of Masses for the repose of the soul of Pope Francis from the Vatican. You'll hear it every morning this week starting at 10 a.m. Eastern, only on EWTN Radio.
We should pray because prayer is conversation with God, and conversation is the only way to build a relationship. We need that relationship with God. We should pray and talk with God about what's on our hearts, what's on our minds, what's active in our lives, the joys we have. We should share all of these with God. Prayer is conversation, and conversation is the only way to build a relationship with God. It's the most important relationship. All of our other relationships depend on this one.
Did you know why the church blesses salt? Salt has always been a valuable commodity. Roman soldiers were paid in salt, hence our word salary. In the book of Leviticus, God told the Israelites to use salt in their sacrifices as a sign of the covenant between God and his people. Elisha at Jericho blessed the river with salt so the water would not cause death or miscarriage. In the New Testament, Jesus calls his disciples the salt of the earth. Today, blessed salt is used as a sacramental. Blessed salt may be sprinkled around a room to ward off evil, or sprinkled in a coat pocket for protection against temptations of the devil. As with all things, sacramentals are not magic in and of themselves, but spiritual gifts coming through Christ to his church. I'm Sandra McDevitt for EWTN Radio.
Tomorrow on More to Life, the life you were meant to live.
We'll look at how the theology of the body can help you live a more abundant life.
That's tomorrow on More to Life, 10 a.m. Eastern, 9 Central on EWTN Radio.
Now back to Called to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Glad you're with us for this Wednesday afternoon call to communion here on EWTN. Still time for your call at 833-288-EWTN. We can squeeze in a few more, I believe. 833-288-3986. Hey, congratulations going out to two long-time EWTN radio partners, Our Lady of Perpetual Help Radio, serving Iowa City, Iowa. They are celebrating 21 years with EWTN, and the Great Covenant Radio Network with 42 signals serving Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, marking 28 years with us. Congratulations to Greg Hamilton and Jim Schnobelin at KOUR, also Tony and Teresa Holman and their great team there at Covenant Network, from your friends here at EWTN. Let's go now to Greg in Chicago, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Hello, Greg. What's on your mind today?
Yeah, hi. Just thought in the wake of Francis's passing, a huge policy for him was the immigration policy. Mm-hmm. And I was just curious to hear the moral case that he would make for immigration policy, particularly into the United States.
Yeah, thanks. So I probably won't be able to give a comprehensive defense of Francis's recommendations on immigration policy, but I can touch on some principles. So, of course, fundamental to the Catholic moral vision is the idea that humans are created with equal dignity in the sight of God. We're all made in his likeness and image, and therefore we all have dignity. And that's one of the great contributions of Christianity to world ethics. It's a doctrine that Aristotle didn't know. Plato didn't know it. To the best of my knowledge, really no pagan thinker was aware of that doctrine. In fact, it seemed to them just empirically obvious that people were not equal and they didn't possess equal dignity, because, of course, empirically they don't. And so Christianity asserted something that wasn't immediately observable, from civil society, namely that you ought to regard the poor, the lame, the blind, the marginalized as equal or even superior to yourself. And that it sort of helps when you worship a crucified Galilean peasant, right, to have that realization, right? And so that was really key to the Catholic moral vision. And another thing key to the Catholic moral vision, also embedded in the text of the New Testament, is the universality of its scope, right? That this takes in the entire human race. And so Paul makes the claim explicitly that in Christ there's no slave or free, male or female, Jew nor Greek. These ethnic, sexual, religious, cultic divisions should no longer separate us, and we have this duty. There's a deep tradition within the Hebrew Bible of care for the immigrant, for the poor, for the foreigner. And the book of Deuteronomy reminds the Israelites, treat the foreigner who lives in your midst fairly because you yourself were foreigners. Don't exploit him, that sort of thing, right? The Catholic doctrine of natural law is we can arrive at these truths philosophically to a certain extent. We're not just reliant on special revelation in sacred scripture. We can observe that all humans universally are rational, and that the same kinds of conditions tend to their flourishing regardless of their contingent position socially or racially or geographically, what have you. And there are certain sort of fundamental human needs, like, of course, the urge to preserve one's life, to propagate oneself, and to be in relationship with one's neighbor and one's family, to know the truth about God and the moral life, and to arrive at a kind of transcendent conception of the self, and to transcend oneself and one's limitations and grow spiritually and morally. These are universal to the human condition, and for them to be realized, certain kinds of social conditions have to be in place. And so you can begin to spell out what the sort of the policy ramifications would be of those philosophical truths. And that's from there in the 17th century and 16th century, we actually begin to see emerge in Catholic moral tradition a doctrine of human rights, which is different from a doctrine of natural law, but an explicit doctrine of human rights, particularly in dealing with the problem of the conquest of the Americas and the poor treatment of indigenous people. There were Catholic theologians that began to posit that indigenous peoples, even non-Catholic peoples, have this thing called rights. Yeah. And of course that gets picked up big time by the Enlightenment thinkers in a secular vein, but it has a Catholic provenance, really, ultimately. And so in the 19th century, Pope Leo XIII begins the great tradition of Catholic social thinking, writes an encyclical on the social question, particularly in response to the rise of atheistic socialism and its antagonism towards the church. And from that time, from say the 1890s forward, the popes have continued that tradition of social thinking, and it really has kind of become the provenance of papal theology. I mean, prior to Pope Leo, popes would occasionally wade in on theology, but they didn't always. I mean, the theologians do that, and the popes kind of run the ship. They didn't always publish these lengthy encyclicals that were meant for everybody to read. But Leo starts that, and it really became the tradition afterwards. And so the tradition of Catholic social thinking develops and grows, and each pope sort of contributes his thoughts. He may not have been the first, but a prominent pope was John Paul II, who wrote a social encyclical called Laborem Exercens, where he explicitly identifies the obligation of wealthy nations to receive the immigrant and the poor, and to make sure that they're not exploited because of their disadvantaged condition. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, which was produced under John Paul's pontificate, actually goes so far as to say, and I'm quoting now, that the more prosperous nations are obliged to the extent that they are able to welcome the foreigner in search of security and the means of livelihood which he cannot find in his own country of origin. The Catholic Church has a doctrine called the universal destination of goods, meaning that the planet and its resources are the patrimony of the human race and not of particular individuals, property rights notwithstanding. And so, if you have a social system in which a small minority of people control the vast majority of resources, such that others in the civilization are not capable of meeting their basic human needs, and those natural rights and natural that proceed from natural law, then the system itself is fundamentally unjust and needs to be changed, right? And that comes into play in immigration, because if you have a situation where in one part of the world it is not possible for people to live and flourish, and it would be possible for them to do so elsewhere, then the wealthier nations who are capable of receiving them should receive them, right? The Church Catechism says that explicitly.
Yeah.
And so, what Francis has taken these principles, which all predate him, both in classical theology and in papal moral theology, and he has drawn some specific policy recommendations from them. Now, here I will step in and make a distinction. John Paul II, in another encyclical called Re Sollicito Re Socialis, says that Catholic moral theology should not be conceived of as politically right or left because it's not political ideology at all, right? And that what it does is it proposes universal principles, but it doesn't specify particular policy interventions. That's the work of policy makers. They should apply the abstract principle to concrete situations.
Sure.
When the Church teaches on moral questions in that abstract way, Catholics either owe, the firmness of the assent of faith or some other kind of assent that is really signals their obedience to the Church. And the degree of assent depends on the weight of the statement and how it's related to divine revelation. But when it comes to policy, Catholics don't owe the same kind of submission to papal statements that they would to dogmatic or doctrinal claims, right?
Yeah.
And what we owe instead is something called a religious submission of mind and will. And that means that, when my pastor gets up and says, hey, the Ten Commandments says that thou shalt not murder, murder is a grave sin, I can't dissent from that, right? I mean, I have to hold that. It's presented to me as part of divine revelation. When the same pastor gets up and says, therefore, you have to vote for this particular social welfare policy because failure to do so is tantamount to murder, right?
Yeah.
I don't have to follow him in that reasoning.
Okay.
I have to agree with him about the immorality of murder. I don't have to necessarily agree with the entailment that he's drawn from it in this particular local context. Now, because of the religious submission in mind and will, I do have another obligation. I can't stand up in Mass on Sunday morning and yell out, "That's stupid, you're wrong," right? Because he's the pastor and I'm not. So he has a position in the Church where he's allowed to speak authoritatively to Catholics, even intervening in these kinds of issues and to make pastoral judgments, all of which are not guaranteed to be correct, right?
Yeah.
And in the same way, there are distinctions within the way I relate to papal statements. So when he's teaching doctrinally from the Church's moral catechesis, yes, I have to agree with him to a certain extent because of my Catholic faith. If he intervenes and says this particular law is immoral, I should listen carefully to what he says and not contradict him in a public venue that would bring scandal if I think he's made a bad judgment. I should take seriously that he's more authoritative than I am, but I don't necessarily have to follow him in every one of his political opinions.
Greg, a great question and a fair one, too. Thanks so much for your call from Chicago. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Let's go to John in Cincinnati, listening on the great Sacred Heart Radio AM 740. Hello, John. What's on your mind today, sir?
Hi. I was listening, and I enjoyed your guest very much. I think I've learned a lot just by listening today. My question is, and I'm a cradle, what do they call them? From cradle to tomb or something.
Sure.
Catholic. I've been a Catholic all my life.
Uh-huh.
And it's getting to the point where I've never seen so much hostility to the Catholic Church, and it's dealing with politics. I had a terrible fight over the Roe versus Wade, and the ACLU just came in and they won the day. And I felt like I've been involved with the Catholic Charismatic movement years ago. I have a great deal of respect for the people I met there and knew there. But we have a chance as Catholics to learn one great amount from our Protestant brothers. I don't know. I don't know I think we need a strategy, that's for sure, and a strategy that should include Christians.
Okay.
And try to focus on what we agree on, not what we disagree on.
I really appreciate that, and I think that much of what you say, the Church is definitely on the same path with you. I mean, one of the main objectives of the Second Vatican Council was to put a positive foot forward for the Church in the public sphere, and to move away from what I think had come to be regarded as sterile polemics. If all you do is attack everybody for disagreeing with you, you just end up preaching to the choir and alienating the people that you're trying to reach.
And weren't there non-Catholics at Vatican II?
There were a couple. There were a few, yes, observers, right? And so I think there's a lot of truth in that statement. I remember one time when I was still Protestant myself, I was at the University of Iowa, and there was a visiting professor from Loyola University of New Orleans, a layman. He was a Catholic ethicist, and he gave a public lecture. Anybody can go hear it, on the ethics of abortion. And I was a evangelical Protestant at the time, and I'd been kind of steeped in the C. Everett Koop and Francis Schaeffer school of anti-abortion politics. And so I said, well, this ought to be interesting. I'll go hear it. And what struck me immediately was that before he even launched into his discussion, he stated that his goal for the talk was not to advocate policy, and he wasn't advocating that abortion should be illegal, just that it was immoral. And he sort of took the political thing off the table entirely. And in doing so, he disarmed a lot of people that were there to attack him. Right? And then he gave a kind of very reasoned, careful, natural law sort of argument for why he believed abortion was intrinsically immoral. And there were a couple of girls in the audience, young women, and one of them raised her hand and said, I came into this talk and I was pro-abortion. I thought that abortion was morally licit. And I now think that you're correct, and I now believe it is immoral. And my jaw dropped nearly to my toes, because in all my life I'd never seen anybody turn on a dime like that on such a touchy issue, And I think that his non-polemical, non-aggressive, very sort of analytical approach that was designed to kind of take the heat down in the room advanced that point of commonality. I remember it wasn't the one thing that made me Catholic, but there were so many bricks in the road that brought me to the Catholic Church. That was definitely one of them. I said, I got to look into this Catholic thing more and the way these Catholic ethicists think and talk. That was kind of impressive to me. I do think there can be a case for drawing distinctions between Catholics and other traditions, and I say that because I'm a convert to Catholicism, and it was the distinctions that made me Catholic. Meaning, I actually was a Protestant in a Protestant seminary, and I had my Protestant professors very, very keen to teach me where the points of difference were between Catholics and Protestants. And they said, here are where the lines are drawn. If you hold this over here, you're a Catholic. If you hold that over there, it's a Protestant. And it really matters what you hold. It really, really matters. And so I took them at their word, and I studied the issues, and I said, yeah, they're right. There are differences. It does matter what you hold, and the Catholics are right. And so I switched.
Wow.
Right? And if someone had come to me and said, there are no differences between Protestants and Catholics, then I would never have become Catholic, because I would have figured, well, then it obviously doesn't matter what I am, right? But because I thought it mattered, I became a Catholic. Now, I have a different disposition now, because back in those days, I thought it was my job to convert everybody. Now I realize it's not my job. My job is to live charitably and to answer questions and objections that people may have about the faith when they bring them, which is what this show does.
Exactly.
But if they're not picking up what I'm laying down, my job is not to beat them over the head with the catechism and try to coerce them into the church.
What a great call, John. Thanks so much. Thanks so much for it from Cincinnati. Excuse me. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Have you checked out EWTN's Podcast Central? Fantastic. Over 100 great podcasts, excuse me, not only programs that we produce here at EWTN, but also some from our partners like Father Cedric Pizzania and his great podcast, Live with Passion. It'll encourage you and lift you up. The motto of Father's ministry is touching lives and saving souls. As you listen, you'll connect with God and grow in your own spiritual life. Don't just live with passion. You'll hear this and other great faith-filled podcasts at EWTN's Podcast Central. Visit EWTN.com/radio and click on Podcast Central today. All right, let's go to Giovanni right now. Giovanni is a first-time caller from Georgia, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Hello, Giovanni. What's on your mind today?
Hey, y'all. How y'all doing?
Doing great.
Thank you for taking my call. I wanted to thank Dr. Anders for basically taking my question at the end of his talk in Lilburn a while back and really having a conversation with me. I don't think you knew how much I needed that, and so I wanted to have the opportunity to be able to thank you. I felt like my faith was being, I don't want to say pulled away from me, but I was being shunned away, I guess you could say. And I'm transgender. I had a lot of things going on, and without getting into what we talked about, you really were able to sit there with me and talk to me and restore a lot of what I felt like I lost. And it's been, so important to me. My faith is really big. I'm a cradle Catholic. And that has been the one thing that's my cross, right? And that I've had to deal with and my journey, and it's been very difficult. And one of the things I think people don't realize is when we say a lot of things, and I understand, the church's stance, we can alienate a lot of people who are really seeking God and desire to know him and to be with him and to, and yes, we're sinners, and yes, we do things and all of that, but, we all are sinners. And so I just want to thank you for extending the grace, the compassion, taking your time to talk with me and really listen to me. And I thought, we had a great conversation, and, we couldn't be two very different people, but we were able to have a conversation and share God's love. And I want to thank you for that from the bottom of my heart.
Giovanni, I profoundly appreciate the call. Of course, I very, very clearly and well remember the conversation. It was deeply meaningful to me as well, and I was touched and moved that you sought me out and opened your life up to me like we did, and it moved me quite a lot. And I've reflected on the conversation a good bit. You just said one thing that struck me, and I thought, I don't feel that way. When you said our lives are very different, and I'm not making this up. Like when you said that, it struck me because I don't feel different from you. Anyone with whom I feel like I have an open and sharing mutual relationship of trust and self-revelation, I don't care where I'm standing and where that person is standing. I feel like in moments like that, we really touch one another's deepest points of commonality, our wounded, insecure humanity with all of its pains and all of its struggles. And those pains and struggles differ from person to person, of course. Sure. But in that fundamental orientation, the desire to do good, to know God, to love another human being, these are the things that really profoundly unite us. And so I hear everything that you're saying, but I feel very much at one with you. I don't feel profoundly different from you. And it's that oneness and that commonality as human beings and as Catholics that makes all those differences unimportant to me. Yeah. And I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you. So thank you so much for calling. And next time I'm back in Lilburn, Georgia, we were at St. John Neumann Catholic Church, although we had a lively debate about whether it was Neumann or Neumann, because it's not the English saint, right, that it's named after, right? What a great time. I had a fantastic time there, and it was such a great cross-section of American Catholicism. We had Anglo-Catholics, we had Hispanic Catholics, we had religious priests from India that were ministering and pastoring the parish. It was like, yep, this is the Catholic Church in America today. Big tent. And I gave a talk there about why people leave the church and what the Catholic Church can do about it. Because a lot of people leave the Catholic Church, and one of my points was that historically Catholics have not done a great job, at least in North America, of encouraging a culture of entrepreneurial lay ministry. And in consequence, individual lay Catholics today will often enter a parish and they feel excluded from the life of the church or from active ministry. And if they feel that exclusion over and over and over again, they eventually just give up and quit trying. It doesn't matter how true the doctrine seems. If they don't experience it in their lived pastoral life, then they think, well, it's just a bunch of hooey, and they walk away. And I'm preaching this message at St. John Neumann, and somebody comes up to me and says, well, Anders, we have something like, I don't remember the number, it was something like 150 lay-initiated, lay-led ministries in this church. Wow. I mean, it was just an astronomical number of outreach programs. And I was like, okay, everything I just said, doesn't apply to you guys. It's a great, great community. So
wow.
I just really enjoyed them, and I appreciate the invitation.
Giovanni, thank you so much for your call. We love you. We love all of our listeners, and thanks again for your call. You reminded me of when we went to go visit our son, who lives in another state, and we went to this one rather large parish. I think I told you about this, and there was a wall, a literal huge wall of ministries that were active at that church, probably, 70 or 80 of them, and they had them all on little 3x5 cards. If you're interested in being a lector, do this, grab this card. If you want to sing in the choir, grab this card. It was fascinating. That is what it's all about.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic.
Here is Kenny now, a first-time caller from Louisiana, listening on the great Catholic Community Media. Hello, Kenny. What's on your mind today?
Hey, thank you, Mr. Tom Price. A question for Dr. Anders. I have a brother. We're in our 60s, and we all grew up Catholic. Catholic school, Catholic church. Uh-huh. And then he left the church many years ago. And I really don't want to get too much more into that other than he can't tell me if he's in a denomination. He did tell me I'm not in any denomination. But anyway, so recently he refused to make the sign of the cross. We have breakfast together. I'll say a breakfast prayer, make the sign of the cross. I'm wondering if he was baptized in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And I think he should want to make that. If he makes the sign of the cross, I think he's afraid that people are going to associate him with a Catholic. He's just so here I am picking and guessing. But my concern about his soul, he was baptized, and then is he denouncing his baptism, and is he denouncing his relationship with the Holy Spirit?
Thank you. Yeah. So that the second part of the question is easy to answer. No, his refusal to make the sign of the cross is not a renunciation of his baptism. It's not a renunciation of his relationship to God or the Blessed Trinity. I don't know where he is in life. He could be a hardened atheist, but I don't think you said he was. But at least just on the surface, just to refrain from making the sign of the cross would not necessarily indicate the intent that you questioned him about.
Okay, all right.
I think you're more on target when you said that he didn't want to do it because he didn't want to be associated with Catholicism. And in the 16th century, Protestants brought the whole Catholic sacramental system and all of the sacraments under criticism, as well as the sacramentals. And the sign of the cross as a blessing is kind of replete within Catholic liturgy, and in the 16th century much more than it is today. And Catholics are not above the sin of superstition, and you will occasionally find Catholics that might use the gesture or some other Catholic sacramental as if it were a kind of good luck charm, right? And I think the kind of sort of knee-jerk reaction against what early Protestants regarded as Catholic superstition would lead them to reject a lot of practices that are basically innocuous at worst and edifying at best because of that kind of overwrought decision to reject anything that smacked of Catholic. There was a 17th century Catholic polemicist named Florimond de Raymond who told a story about a Reformed pastor in 17th century France that rebuked one of his parishioners for praying in the church on a weekday because it smacked too much of like the Catholic hallowing of sacred places. And the man looked at his pastor and said, "Surely I had not known until now that it was wrong to pray to God."
In a church.
In a church, right, exactly.
Gotta love that. Kenny, thanks so much for your call. Dr. David Anders, thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
See you tomorrow right here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Have a wonderful day, and please pray for the next Pope. I think that's a great idea. God bless.
This is Father Ken Geraci. The necessity for us to take advantage of the sacrament of confession because it is God's divine mandate given to us.
Protecting the sanctity of life.
This is EWTN